Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I want to draw on the situation that's been occurring a lot, and I've been reporting a lot in terms of the exam grades awarding, to discuss when a minister should resign and when it is reasonable, even when they or their department have failed, for them to retain their jobs. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So we see it all the time, of course, don't we? When a department fails as part of government, there are always calls from political opponents for the minister, the head of that department, to resign. It happens all the time. It's all part of party politics. But when should they and when should they not? Now, for this one, I'm going to draw on the exam grades fiasco because we have an interesting dichotomy here, because we have the Scottish government, for students in Scotland, of course, and we have the Westminster government for students in England and Wales, who have both failed. Now, with Scotland, they have reversed their earlier decision, not necessarily in the best way. Now, I'm not going to talk about the details of that, because what I want to do is focus on the calls for the resignation for the different education secretaries. So in Scotland, for the Scottish government, the education secretary is John Swinney. And of course, there were calls for his resignation. In Westminster, the education secretary is Gavin Williamson, and there are calls from within England and Wales for him to resign over his failure to deal with this as well. And the interesting thing is of course, this is where party politics really shows its true colours. So, the results were announced in Scotland before they were announced in England and Wales, and therefore the Eye of Sauron fell upon the Scottish government before the Westminster government. And Scottish Conservatives were calling for John Swinney, the Scottish Education Secretary, to resign, as were Labour and the Liberal Democrats as well. Now, interestingly, now that the results have come out in England, and do you know what? It's actually, if anything, even worse, but it is nonetheless the same failure has occurred in England and Wales. And a number of those Scottish Conservatives who last week were tweeting that John Swinney, Scottish Education Secretary, should resign, have deleted those tweets. They've been deleting those tweets because now the calls are for their own party's Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, the Conservative Education Secretary that's managing or mismanaging affairs in England and Wales. There are calls for him to resign. But although there are some calls from within the Conservative Party, I have to say there are some Conservative MPs who are tapping Boris Johnson on the shoulder and going, this isn't good enough. Nonetheless, generally speaking, the party's rallying around its own, much as the SNP, of course, have done with their own Education Secretary, which really highlights the party political nature of it. You know, because if a Conservative minister fails quite badly, then SNP, the Scottish National Party, will call for their resignation. They have done recently, as will Labour, as will the Liberal Democrats, and vice versa. It's all part of party politics. However, does that mean that calls for a minister to resign are always unjustified? No. I mean, if you think about some of the cock-ups that ministers make, if they were to do that in a normal job, you would be out on your ear. There'd be no question about it. So the idea that a minister should have to give up their position under certain circumstances, of course, has to be there. You can't say, that it's a job as long as the Prime Minister, or the First Minister in the case of Scotland, has confidence in you. There has to be some sort of rules. And there is a convention which is called individual ministerial responsibility. Now, this convention holds that the minister is ultimately responsible for the performance of their department. If their department fails, they bear responsibility. Now, responsibility doesn't always have to mean resign. So how serious does something have to be in order to resign? Malfeasance is the most common reason why there will be sensible cause for a minister to resign. Now, obviously, any form of corruption, or if you've lied to the public or broken the law, then absolutely ministers should resign. And that has been a feature of Boris Johnson's government, that has not been happening. You know, we've had ministers that have broken the law. We've had no criminal trials resulting from it, but they've nonetheless broken the law. In one case, Robert Jenrick even admitted doing so. Still in place. We've had ones involved in scandals involving bullying, like Priti Patel, still in place. We had Dominic Cummings, who's not a government minister, but a government official. Same thing applies to them. If you break the law, then if you don't follow your own rules, then you're supposed to, well, you'd be sacked. He hasn't been sacked. So we certainly wouldn't expect Boris Johnson to force any of his ministers to resign over anything. But malfeasance basically would suggest that there's been a failure which was deliberate. It sounds odd, but it does happen. Now, to what extent will that apply in this particular case? Now, I'm going to précis this by just explaining that my personal view is, in terms of who should and who should not resign, as someone who can speak entirely for myself, I don't have to speak up for a party, I would say that I do not believe that the Scottish Education Secretary, John Swinney, should have resigned. I am quite happy that he remains in post. But there is going to be a caveat to that. Now, if I were a Labour MP, I would absolutely be calling for his resignation, because at the end of the day, this is the party political nature of it. What you absolutely do is, when your political opponent, I have actually done my back in moving and I have to get a lumbar support. When you have a political opponent makes a massive cock up, it's all part of the political game. You call for their resignation. You put public pressure on them. And when they don't resign, because it's a win-win for you. Because if they do resign, weakness. And if they don't resign, you're thumbing your nose at the public. You know, you're saying that the failure doesn't matter. It's not important enough for someone to actually resign over. So it's a win-win situation. That's why it's done. And everyone engages in it. But Gavin Williamson, I do think, did. And it comes down to this issue of malfeasance. So, John Swinney, the main problem was that the way the grades were awarded in Scotland failed to take account of different demographics having some unconscious bias introduced into the system. So disadvantaged students were more disadvantaged in the downgrading of grades than students from other backgrounds. And the thing is, had that just happened and it had emerged when the results came out, then I would just say, do you know what? I mean, it's a cock-up. What they've done now in Scotland is they've just gone with teacher predictions. That's not a good system either, because, you know, some teachers will have inflated the grades. Some students, as a result of this, will have got grades they shouldn't have done. That being said, it's the lesser of two evils. However, had they got the system right from the start, we wouldn't have had to have either of the extremes, where people from certain backgrounds are either massively advantaged or disadvantaged. And the Education Secretary in Scotland was warned about the potential for disadvantage in certain students before the results came out. So they would have been aware. So does that make it deliberate that they persisted anyway? Not necessarily, because this is where I'd be prepared to give the benefit of the doubt. Because in his particular case, I might accept that he was advised by officials that the fears that were articulated were unfounded, and that their system would deal with it. In which case, he will have made the decision to okay the procedure, and then when it turns out, actually, no, it didn't work after all, well, you can just put that down to a cock-up, and cock-ups happen, and he's attempted to rectify it in the best way he could, and personally, independently, I would say, well, let's draw a line under it, and that's fine. Were I a Labour MP, I would not be saying that. But there you go. Now, in the case of Gavin Williamson, this is more interesting because in England and Wales, and I talked about this in the video earlier today, it's obvious that there was deliberate bias put into disadvantage people from poorer backgrounds and advantage people from wealthier backgrounds, because the algorithm that was used to determine grades in England and Wales was not applied to all students. It was applied selectively. So, for example, teacher predictions, teacher grades and ranks, which is what was asked from teachers, were used for private schools. They were basically used for smaller centres. Larger centres like colleges, which of course are state funded and provide education for people from ordinary backgrounds, the teacher predictions were not used. They were entirely automated. So they used a different system for colleges, state funded colleges, and for private schools. And there were a few others in the mix on either side as well. But the key take home is they used a different system for awarding grades for private schools than they did for state funded colleges. That required a decision to be made, and that required the Education Secretary to go along with it. So this wouldn't have been a case of people pointing out where the pitfalls may be and the Education Secretary being advised by their officials, no, it's okay, we think we can sort it. We don't think it's a well-founded concern. To the Education Secretary had to have signed off on this, knowing full well that they were going to use a different system from people who attended one type of school to those who attended a different type of school. Knowing also that people who go to private school come from wealthy backgrounds, and people who go to state-funded colleges, although some may come from wealthy backgrounds, the majority of them will not. They'll just come from ordinary backgrounds or even poorer backgrounds. So from that point of view, I think the failure is not just incompetence or overconfidence in your own system in England and Wales. It is deliberate. And for that reason, I would say that Gavin Williamson would be guilty of malfeasance and should resign, whereas John Swinney in Scotland is guilty only of ignoring valid concerns, not being aware that they were valid. Because at the end of the day, a politician doesn't have to be a statistical expert. Very often they are not. So that one is just down to incompetence, and they have sought to correct it. Now, I'm not going to judge Gavin Williamson on the seeking to correct it, because at the end of the day, the Scottish government blamed teachers for a full week before they relented. Well, the results have only just come out in England and Wales. They are blaming teachers. We'll see what happens in a week's time. But nonetheless, the situation as is known at the moment would mean that I would say John Swinney didn't need to resign. Gavin Williamson does. But probably won't if past record of Boris Johnson's ministers is anything to go by. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.